Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for a conversation with Nicholas Graham and Cecelia Moore, authors of UNC A to Z, What Every Tar Heel Needs to Know About the First State University. My name is Talia. I'm the events manager here at Flyleaf. Before I introduce our guests, I'd love to give y'all a quick update on what our virtual calendar is looking like for the fall. So recently we've hosted Jill McCorkle and Frances Mays, a panel of romance authors, Kristen Rademacher, and most recently Ron Rash with D.G. Martin last week. If you missed any of those events and you'd like to catch up, you can catch those on our Facebook page, just under videos. And then leading up to the election, we have a slate of really fun social and political oriented events coming up. So those include Jean Nickel talking about Indecent Assembly, William Darity and Kirsten Mullen to talk about From Here to Equality, and James Laludis and Robert Korstad for Fragile Democracy. You can find out more about those events and others on our calendar. It's flyleafbooks.com/event. And then for me, I just want to say that hosting events has helped me out a lot in terms of feeling in community with people. And I hope that y'all can continue to join us for more, because I think it's a really important way to stay connected to each other. Without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our guests. Nicholas Graham is the UNC Chapel Hill University archivist, or do you say archivist?
I say archivist.
Archivist, okay, good. I never know, that's like one of those words that you always read and you never actually hear out loud, at least for me. He is an alumnus of the School of Information and Library Science at UNC Chapel Hill and has worked in the Wilson Special Collections Library since '03. Prior to coming to UNC, he worked in libraries at the University of Georgia, MIT, and Massachusetts Historical Society. Cecelia Moore is the former university historian at UNC Chapel Hill, where she was also the project manager for the Chancellor's Task Force on University History. She received her PhD in history from UNC Chapel Hill, and in addition to UNC A to Z, she's also the author of The Federal Theater Project in the American South, The Carolina Playmakers, and The Quest for American Drama. Nick and Cecilia's new book, UNC A to Z, compiles a ton of useful, interesting, and just plain fun information about UNC's history, influential people and places, traditions, and more. It is really a must-have for anyone who's passionate about UNC or curious to learn more about our university in town. So I'm going to hop out of the conversation, let Nick and Cecelia present, and then I'll reappear in a bit to guide the Q&A. Thank you both so much for joining us, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say about UNC.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Talia. We thought we would talk a little bit about our backgrounds and some of the things about how the book came to be this evening, and we'll start with that. So I wanted to let Nick tell a little bit about his work at UNC and what being university archivist involves.
Sure. Thanks. And thanks to Flyleaf. We're pleased to be doing this. We wish we could be with you all in person, but this is great. So I work in the university archives. I've worked in Wilson Special Collections Library for many years now. In the university archives, we're home to all the official records of the university. So those go back from 1789 to the present. So, you know, old manuscripts, handwritten documents, all the way up to modern digital media. And so in that work, I work with campus offices, but I also do a lot of work on university history. And that work has, led me to investigate on my own, many of the questions that we cover in the book. But it was exciting to be able to, step a little bit aside from the immediate requirements of the work and be able to delve into UNC history in a different and exciting way. Cecelia, I know you had a different type of experience working at the university when you were there for many years.
I did, actually. Before I took on the role of university historian, I was a special assistant in the chancellor's office for many years as a speechwriter and background writer. And before that, I had worked in development, both for Playmakers and for Central Development. So my audience often was explaining UNC history to administrators and people who were new to UNC that way. So Nick, this book was originally your idea. So what inspired you to think it up, and what were your goals for it?
Sure. Well, to me, it was kind of an obvious idea based on my work as a reference librarian in Wilson Library. So I began working in reference in the North Carolina collection, and using some of the amazing statewide reference sources. The three books edited by William S. Powell are landmarks of North Carolina history: the Gazetteer, the Encyclopedia, and the Dictionary of North Carolina Biography. And then, to supplement those, the library had so many resources that have been prepared by librarians over the years. Sometimes they were in filing cabinets, sometimes they were, compiled in, photocopied books. But, it was so helpful to have everything at our fingertips. But the one thing that was missing was kind of like just a regular go-to ready reference source for UNC history. And, I wanted to have something like that for many years. And since no one else had taken it on, eventually I decided that it would be something that, that I could do on my own. I'd learned enough about campus history then that I was, willing to take it on, but I knew it was not something that, if it was going to be done really well, I would need help. And I know that, your work especially in the chancellor's office, brought you all kinds of questions. Similar to the way I was receiving questions from, undergrads and alums, you were hearing questions from a different audience.
That's true, very definitely. Senior administrators, not only in South Building but across campus, and sometimes staff people who often were asking questions about history that were related to something going on in the current moment. And oftentimes there was no like easy short reference to point them to, or to look up something quickly. And not quite unlike undergraduate students, administrators rarely have the time to read a whole book. So they're often looking for that short answer and that quick answer. And so that's what intrigued me about the project when I came onto it. And the fact that it could be something that was sort of a first step. You would first look there, you could find a quick answer, it would be accessible. One of the things that we talked about, and I really like, is that what UNC Press did with the cover of the book is they engaged an artist, Kristen Solecki, to design the cover. And I think we both felt like that cover gives it sort of a friendly, accessible feel. And that's what we wanted, really.
Yeah, we did. And, as we really dove into it, one of the biggest challenges was trying to figure out, what to include and what not to include. And we had multiple conversations. We had a spreadsheet that, it may have been as many as 500 entries at one point, eventually got down to 300. But do you want to talk some about, those conversations and how we ended up with our final list?
We did. That was an ongoing conversation all the way through, even to the final stages of the manuscript. But early on, one of the things we decided we wouldn't do is we wouldn't try to do individual entries on people. We wouldn't do biographical entries because it would just overwhelm the whole project. And so that was something that we knew we needed to figure out how to talk about people. So, but that we couldn't do those individual entries and really do justice to what the kind of book we wanted. So we did know that we settled on all of the buildings. There's entry on every building because that covered many names associated with the history of UNC. We wanted to also include, we wanted to include academic programs, and that was an area where we went back and forth quite a bit. There's an entry on every school and the college, but we sort of opted finally not to try to do entries on individual academic departments because it was too hard to try and do a short entry about the history of that department within its discipline and things like that. So there's only a few departments like that. Another area that was a big question for us was athletics. So I'll let you talk about that.
Sure. Athletics, similar to to biographical materials, athletics could also had the potential to overwhelm the book. And the evidence of this is that there are so many great full-length books about UNC athletics. I think about some of the materials, the books written by Adam Lucas. Lee Pace has a beautiful full-length book just about Kenan Stadium alone. And then, to add to that, the media relations at the UNC athletic department produces amazing work. So we figured that, we wanted this to be, to cover athletics. And so the way we treated it is, we really looked at the early years for many of the major sports, especially the establishment of athletics in the late 19th and early 20th century at UNC. And then we talk a lot in the book about some of the ways that some of our kind of the most common or most treasured campus traditions, like the alma mater, the Tar Heel, the Yakety Yak, the school colors, even the UNC adopting the Tar Heels nickname, all came about with the rise of intercollegiate athletics in the late 1890s. So rather than providing these full histories of each athletic program, which largely you can find elsewhere, we talked about tried to place it somewhat of a larger context. Another challenge that we faced, and that I think will be obvious to anyone who follows the university, is that we were writing history while it was changing all around us, and that was evident in the breaking news that kept coming, and the ongoing protests and controversies.
That's true. Talia mentioned my work as project manager on the Chancellor's Task Force on University History, and that came about after the trustees opted to change the name of Carolina Hall, remove William Saunders's name and rename it Carolina Hall, and out of their desire to find ways to better tell university history and to help students especially understand that history. And so that was underway. At the time, the Confederate monument, Silent Sam, was still up and remained a point of disagreement and contestation. And so all of that fed into how we were thinking about the entries and what we knew we wanted people to know more about. And of course, we knew inevitably that we weren't going to be current, that the book would get published at some point and that things would keep changing. So of course, as we know, even from then, the trustees just recently opted to remove more names from buildings for various reasons. And there's a new commission underway to do more, to tell more history. So that was a hard choice.
It's a challenge, but it also brings kind of a new energy and interest to campus history. Students more than ever, student activists and others, and staff and faculty are engaging with campus history in a way that that I haven't seen in my nearly 20 years at the university. People are realizing the vital importance that the past has to the way things are done today, and so that makes it even more important. I think to have a book like this, made us even more excited to work on it. And talk with people about it. And, as always, we draw on, the work that's been done in the past, and we want this to be a starting place for further questions and further research. In addition to, questions about writing history as it's changing, the other thing that comes up a lot is, since we work on this type of work, we're often asked to place current events in a historical context. And that's relevant now more than ever. With the global coronavirus pandemic. One of the things that, when we look at it, placing it in a larger context, things to note, which we try to find other moments in history where, the university has struggled through national or international crises. Certainly the university has stayed open through Civil War and 2 world wars. There have been other public health crises on campus. There was a brief smallpox scare. There were some football games canceled in the mid-20th century over concerns about a polio outbreak. And just this morning, I learned from research Cecelia was doing that there was a very serious influenza epidemic on campus in the 1940s as well. But the one that is, the most that most people like draw comparisons to is the international flu pandemic in 1918. And I will turn to Cecelia for more on that.
So that is the most obvious, and with the centennial of that epidemic happening over the last couple of years, quite a few people did a lot of conferences and papers and stuff about it. But certainly the 1918-19 influenza pandemic impacted UNC in kind of dramatic ways. Mm-hmm. There ended up being only about 500 students who got sick, though that was a considerable amount considering it was a much smaller student body then, but only 7 deaths of students. The other thing that happened, though, was that University President Edward Kidder Graham died from the flu in the fall of 1918. And just a few months later, his successor, Marvin Hendricks Stacy, also died from the flu. And so that was a big impact for the campus, especially when it was also still in the middle of World War I and was doing military training. And so there was a lot of different changes going on there. The other thing I think I would say is that in terms of times when the university has been tried, Nick mentioned that the university managed to stay open through the Civil War and 2 world wars. It only closed once in the post-Civil War years of Reconstruction from 1871 to 1875, and that was due mainly to politics. So it takes politics to close the university, apparently.
One of the things that we often get asked and that we like to talk about, obviously, so we're going to ask ourselves is what some of our favorite entries are. Since we're among friends, we'll say that some of these were a little bit of a slog to write. Very few, but most of them were a source of excitement and fun. So, Cecelia, what are some of your favorites in the book that you worked on?
So, one of my favorite entries is actually several entries, but there's a main entry for women at UNC, and with the current another anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, I was reminded in looking back again at the women at UNC. Women were not admitted for the first 100 years or so, not until the 1890s. And then only white women, the first white women came in the 1890s. And then later during integration in the 1950s, African-American women and Native American women. So it is for the first 100 plus years, 150 years of history, the student body looked very different than it looks now. And so it's always interesting to kind of help students now understand that.
Yeah.
Another entry that's a favorite entry for me is utilities. There is an entry on utilities. With a 225-year-old campus, which, I think Nick observed, not many universities also had to build a town structure and infrastructure as they built the campus, which is what happened with Chapel Hill. So the utilities, in terms of how the university built the utility systems for the town as through time, but also went back and built in indoor plumbing and electricity and all of those things now into those early 19th century buildings is really, to me, a fascinating story. So those are my favorite ones. What about you, Nick?
Some of the things that I thought were really neat were we have an entry on Chapel Hill grit, and that was not something it was not a term I had heard when I first came to UNC, or even for many of my first years here. And that is the distinctive kind of reddish brown pebbly gravel that appears on many walkways on campus. You can still see them in the Arboretum and then some of the walkways on North Street. It used to be all over campus, but apparently Chapel Hill grit is a distinctive local type of gravel that was named after our town. We've got an entry on brick walkways about how, it was initially controversial to pave them all. The older alums who always lament things changing thought that it would destroy the character of campus to have the brick walkways there. There are some other student traditions that I thought were especially fun to write about. I won't go into what they are. I'll let you look up some of them. The cake race is one that nobody's heard of in a long time. The Cardboard Club, which some older alums remember, especially from football games. I especially enjoyed some of the student traditions that came about in the late 1960s, early 1970s, like High Noon, where students gathered every day at noon around the bell tower to smoke pot. And the Invisible University of North Carolina, when a group of countercultural students decided they weren't getting exactly what they wanted from the university curriculum, so started offering classes on their own. And they had one that was that sought to improve relations between students and campus police, and it was called the Fuzzies and the Fuzz. My favorite probably is the entry for Vandermint Auditorium, which you won't recognize unless you've seen the movie This Is Spinal Tap. On one of the stops in the Spinal Tap tour, they talk about Vandermint Auditorium in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. There is no Vandermint Auditorium at UNC, but I like to, pass maybe Wool and Jim sometimes and think about it as a home for the stop on the endless tour of the band Spinal Tap.
I would also just say quickly too, we are even really almost as soon as we turned the manuscript in, we started thinking about entries that we wanted to add, and entries we needed, of course, to change and update. But so we're really interested tonight when you ask questions about what entries, what will help inform that list of new entries that we'll probably add for the second edition. But now we'll hand it back to Talia.
Hello, I'm back. Thanks for so much for sharing. I was curious about what your favorite entries were, so I'm glad you went ahead and answered that question. I actually posted like a question stamp on Flyleaf's Instagram earlier, asking people their favorite spots on UNC campus. So that would be, if anyone wants to check that out, head over to our Instagram. We have been updating our story with what people responded. I think it's been interesting. All right, so to go through some of our questions from the audience, Linda has a few questions at the top of the chat. She says, beyond the obvious, how did you ever decide what to include and what to leave out? I think you guys mostly answered that one. I didn't notice when I was flipping through that you didn't do biographies because I saw names for people, but they're just included in the other thing. So I think that that's a really clever way to have done that. Are the sidewalk bricks made locally? You addressed the grit. What about the bricks?
It's a great question. I don't know.
I don't know either. I'm pretty sure they're made in North Carolina, but now I'll have to go find out. Yeah, we'll have to go find out.
Someone said, or Linda again said, I've always thought it would be wonderful to have the UNC chancellor living on Franklin Street. Has that change ever had any real traction, or is it just the wistful musings of a few?
I think it's more wistful musings. They're talking about, that question comes with the UNC system president's house is on Franklin Street. That house was originally the UNC, before there was a system, there was the University of North Carolina was just the UNC the Chapel Hill campus, and the president lived in that house. But when the system got created, and I forget how it all turned out now, it's too long to talk about, the chancellor's residence is now down on Raleigh Road, off of Raleigh Road, and the UNC system president lives on Franklin Street. And there are people who think that should be switched. But I think
Cecelia wrote that entry and mentions that it comes up all the time in the entry. I would suspect that the UNC chancellor, who lives, kind of at the bottom of the hill, a little bit deeper in the woods, it's a newer space, probably easier to have for events, and also a good bit more privacy. So that may be a consideration too. The system president's office on Franklin Street is very much in a public space. But yeah, if that discussion has really been had, it hasn't been had publicly.
Yeah, I definitely have. I think walked in a protest that went up to the UNC system president's house. So it's not private. That's for sure. All right. Do you know the names of any flower ladies and if any of them are still living?
I don't know how many people remember the Flower Ladies. They were a group of women. It was predominantly local African-American women who sold flowers from their gardens on Franklin Street. And that was a tradition, I think, from the early to mid 20th century. And it ended around the late 1960s, but largely ended around the late 1960s when a former coworker explained it to me as like the hippie vendors, saying the hippie vendors came and also set up shop. And so the town passed an ordinance that ended up excluding the Flower Ladies as well. I remember some of them operating in the Bank Plaza off of Franklin Street in the mid 1990s. I do not know any of, if any of them. I'm sure that, you know, some of the ladies who sold flowers or their families are still local, but I'm not sure. Cecelia, do you know?
I don't know either, and that's a good question. I'm going to sort of check with the Chapel Hill historians and see. There may be more. There may be interviews with them for all I know.
Yeah, that sounds lovely. I wish that still existed. I think that would be really nice. And it sounds like, I mean, the implication of that is sort of like gentrification took them away. Yeah, like so many lovely things. And yet, you know, we'll see. Maybe eventually we'll get some version of that back.
It would be nice.
Would be.
Paul says, was Spangler the last president to regularly eat with students in the dining hall?
Go ahead, Nick.
I don't know. I'm trying to remember. I feel like Tom Ross may have showed up once, but I don't think he made a regular thing of it.
Yeah.
Cecelia, do you know, you worked for several chancellors. Do you know if any chancellors regularly ate in the dining hall?
No, I'm pretty sure chancellors never regularly ate in the dining hall. I think Spangler was, he was a sort of a unique individual in that regard. And I feel pretty sure that many of the students that ate with him and around him never even knew who he was. But he did. I do know from my years at Playmakers that when Michael Hooker was chancellor, he would occasionally slip into the Paul Green Theater when they were rehearsing a play and sit and watch rehearsal. And not many people know that, but he would.
Chancellor Hooker also crowd surfed in the student section at UNC basketball games. And I'm pretty confident he's the last chancellor to do that.
Wow. Yeah, I was at UNC when, I think at the beginning of the time that Chancellor Folt was the chancellor, and I don't remember her socializing in any of those ways.
Right.
All right, let's see. So this is a question from Pat. Pat says, how will you handle the renaming of buildings, I guess, in terms of updating the book for future editions? You kind of addressed that a little bit in that it's already happening. And I guess with any new edition, I guess.
Right. We'll just change. I mean, what we did with Carolina Hall, I think, is we have an entry for Carolina Hall, but in that entry, we mention its former name. And William Saunders's name is in the index. So I don't know. We'll have to see when we get to that.
Yeah.
And it's, if we do a new edition, I hope we do, it'll be just like this. At some point, we have to just stop. I mean, I think that the very last change we made to this one was we had a list of chancellors in there. And like the day before we had to submit the final thing, they announced that we had Kevin Guskowitz listed as an interim chancellor, and we were able to take interim off. And I think that was our last change. So building names will do the same. We've got a running list of things we know we need to update. And those 4 buildings are challenging because the names have been removed, but there's still going to be a process, as I understand, of renaming them.
Right.
So, we would never be done if we waited for everything to be finalized, because it won't. So, whenever the UNC Press says they're ready for a new edition, we'll figure out how long we can go before we have to submit the final copy.
Yeah, and I can imagine that that's going to be sort of an ongoing process. Let's see. Anne says, did you ever consider crowdsourcing entries? I'm not sure what that would look like, but.
We talked about, UNC Press was really interested in doing a digital version of this as well. And that may be a space where we initially update entries. And that's available now at UNCA2Z.com. And that was a collaboration between the press and the Digital Innovation Lab, which is in the College of Arts and Sciences at UNC. We did not. There are so many amazing UNC history resources out there. Of varying, kind of quality and authority. So we wanted something that was authoritative and had a distinctive tone. I would love to see what crowdsourcing was like.
Yeah, and clarified in the comments, by crowdsourcing, I mean asking people what entries they thought were needed. I mean, it sounds like you kind of are already like listening to what people are talking about. Right. And making a list. So
I think I know part of it was sort of trying to find a balance between what, especially when you talk about the traditions and things like that, what current alumni remember and what current students, what's meaningful to them. So at any moment it's a snapshot, but that's a great way to sort of consider how you might add things.
And we still want to hear those ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody has any ideas, feel free to drop them in the comments. We can maybe go through at the end and read a little, read it out like a list. Speaking of which, Hugh asked, how could you write about Chapel Hill without mentioning the hot nuts? What are the hot nuts? I don't know anything about this.
We let them out? So that's one of the sort of the other ongoing thing when you're trying to be timely with a manuscript is every time you look at it again, you worry about what you've left out and what mistakes there are. The Hot Nuts were a local band that achieved quite a regional fame. And I think we did leave them out.
I think, but that was, one of the challenges was how much to write about Chapel Hill.
Yes.
Chapel Hill has a distinctive history that is, it's distinct from the history of UNC in some ways, but it completely overlaps with UNC history in other ways. I think, I think that's a great, the entry on Chapel Hill includes, it's the local music scene and some notable bands. And I think there's clearly one that we need to add when we work on a new edition.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. You might make it into the next edition. Anne says, are there entries that you think might be or become controversial?
One of the things that I learned that I thought was interesting was been the origins of the use of the Tar Heel nickname to refer to UNC. And, so the nickname itself, has a complicated origin story that we won't go into now, but when it was initially used a lot by newspaper journalists, they referred to any team from North Carolina when they were playing a team from another state as the Tar Heels. So I found a reference to like a North Carolina state before it went by that name, but it was still the State College of Agricultural and Manufacturing at the time. The journalist referred to them as the Tar Heel Farmers. And found another example of the team from Trinity, which predated Duke, as using the Tar Heel nickname. So it was a while before it became associated in athletics strictly with UNC. Would that be controversial? I don't know. I think it would be interesting for more loyal UNC fans to learn.
For sure. I didn't know that. Yeah, it makes me cringe to even hear you say that other schools were referred to as the Tar Heels. Let's see. Is there an entry on S-Cheats? It's a question from Anne. Yeah?
I believe so, yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about that?
I'm going to look it up, Cecelia, if you want to talk.
Okay. So S-Cheats is the term for the estates of people who died without cheats, who died without wills and heirs. And it's important to UNC's history because in the beginning, the state legislature did not support UNC with appropriations when they first chartered the university and it opened. They had the university rely on tuition income, and also, but what they did do was grant the university trustees the right to collect on its cheats. So those estates of people who died without heirs, without wills, instead of the state taking that property, UNC got that. Oh. And so UNC appointed agents throughout the state to process those and to deal with them in county courthouses. And so many times most of the time what happened is that the university agent would sell the property and then that money would come to the university. And until 1865, those estates included land and property, but they also often included enslaved people because they were legally property. And many people don't understand or didn't understand until several people started really doing more talking and writing about this topic, how much UNC was funded from the sale of enslaved people.
And that's an example of a topic that I don't expect would be controversial. But I think that, the university has a lot more reckoning work to do and a lot more understanding of its history to do, especially the extent to which slavery played a role, not just in the building of the university, but in the funding of it as well.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. We have a question from Lori. I heard Armistead Maupin wrote for the Daily Tar Heel. Is that true?
He did, and I believe he was a conservative columnist at the time compared to his fellow journalists. And our colleague Ken Zogry has a book about the Daily Tar Heel, which I highly recommend, which talks about Maupin and the many other Tar Heel journalists and editors over the years. Yeah,
can you repeat the colleague's name?
Historian Ken Zogry, Zogry. And Cecelia, what is it called? Print News Raise Hell?
Print News and Raise Hell. It's the history of the Daily Tar Heel.
Okay. I believe it's UNC Press.
I will find that and drop the link in the chat. Let's see. Ted says, tell me about your struggle to find an entry for the letter X.
We have one?
Do we have one?
I don't remember.
It's really sad.
No X, I know.
No. But there is an entry for the letter Z.
Yes. And yeah. We didn't want to be desperate and write about, X-rays or rated movies on campus. WXYC is, significant X.
If he has a suggestion for an entry under the letter X, we would definitely be interested in hearing about it.
Love it. Yep.
I just found the link for that book, so that's in the chat. Let's see. We did answer the question, will there be a digital edition? That's all on your website. Do you want to tell us that link?
I believe it's just UNCA2Z.com. And it is. Again, from the work of the UNC Digital Innovation Lab.
Right. Yeah, I looked at that website earlier today, and it's impressive. It's all there.
It is. And there's also the ability for people to post comments there too. Right. So that would be, if people want to have comments about an entry or questions, they can go there.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure that will influence in part what y'all do for the second edition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I have a question here from Linda. Is there an entry on the railroad from the west that came to the campus during construction?
Yes.
Yes, there's an entry on University Railroad.
Right.
And it does talk about when it, stretched across the campus, it's the late 1920s.
I didn't know about that.
Yes.
There's
When
a
they
lot.
were build-
A lot I need to learn about UNC
There's
history,
a
it sounds
lot.
like.
When they were building with the buildings around Polk Place, they were building. It was the first one of the early building booms, and they were building so many buildings at once that they built a railroad spur from the west right into almost like where the flagpole is now in Polk Place, so they could just deliver construction materials straight there.
I know
There's
they
photographs.
a lot of the Wilson Library. Yeah.
Huh. I guess that makes sense. Easy access for the heavy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let me see. Do we have any other questions? Anne says, speaking of dining halls, do you talk about the Carolina Inn cafeteria?
Yeah, the Carolina Inn entry mentions it, and this may be true for you, but I always heard of it as a particularly beloved space of UNC employees. It was a great place to get a cheap lunch on campus, and it was a casualty of a Carolina Inn renovation.
Was.
It's too bad.
I got to eat there once right before it closed in the mid-90s.
I see Hugh said in the chat, I thought the Z entry would be about Zeta Psi. And it did make me think, how do you address Greek life on UNC
That's a good question.
campus?
Yeah. The Z entry, if you don't have your book right in front of you, is for Jesse Helms's apocryphal zoo comment about Chapel Hill. Cecelia, do you want to talk about Greek life?
There is an entry for Greek life, but we didn't deal with the individual fraternities and sororities in separate entries. Perhaps we should, or different ones. Not too sure about that.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting, but I also think it already, at least when I was a student at UNC, it already felt like the Greek life was taking up a bit too much attention relative to the percentage of students who are actually involved. So I can see both sides of that argument.
And those are similar to, even more so than academic programs. Those would be just hard stories to summarize. I mean, each one would be the same. It would talk about the founding, and then maybe some notable alums. In some cases, maybe notable controversies or tragedies, but there wouldn't be a lot to say for each of those. For a large audience, I think. I think for the members and alums, it would be interesting.
Yeah, I think that what you did makes sense, and it seems logical to sort of group it together. Do you plan to do any kind of entry for COVID-19 or how the university handled this?
Yes.
This really is an unprecedented time in campus history. So, one of the entries we talked about that we needed to do we didn't do was one on campus police, and we need to look more.
Right.
And whenever we do a next edition, we'll add something on the COVID-19 pandemic. Hopefully, with a final sentence about how it all ended, and we move. But we'll see.
Yeah, I'd love some resolution. Yeah. Let's see. All right, final question. One more from Anne. Anne has a lot of questions. Did you have a consistent word count goal for each entry? Was there some standard you kept to, or does it kind of vary?
It varies.
It varies. Generally, we strove for entries that might be one paragraph or two, but then designated certain subjects and certain entries that we knew we were going to write something longer about.
We kind of did it based on feel, and I hope that comes through and that there's a consistent kind of tone and feel throughout. Sometimes we'd find a lot of interesting stuff and get excited about a topic and then write it and then think that's way too much, and then have to take things out. But yeah, some are really complicated, and need very long entries. So the one on slavery, for example, is an especially long one. The one on, I think, Reconstruction and the closing of the university, there's a lot to explain. A lot of the building names, especially the more recent buildings, are just, a paragraph.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, in contrast to the longer ones, what were the hardest ones were the buildings? Or the hardest to, fill space?
For the buildings built in the last 20 years.
Because there's not a lot of history, right?
Yeah, some of the research buildings, there's not a lot to say about them.
Right. Because their purpose hasn't changed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Just want to close out with some nice comments from people. Hugh says, you guys are terrific, and so is your book. Paul says, great work, guys. Let's see. Victor said, I look forward to reading UNC A to Z. Thank you for writing it. We have a lot of appreciation. Missy commented, so excited for you. So there's definitely an audience for this book. I think that it will, when Flyleaf reopens, it'll be one of those ones that people pick up, especially new families coming to bring students to the university. I think that's going to be a bestseller for us. And I think that, especially with new editions, will be something people continue to return to over time. So thank you guys so much for writing this book. Thank you for joining us. And I want to give y'all a quick reminder in the audience that we do have copies with signed book plates that we will include. There's a link right under our faces to go and buy that. Also, if you'd like to support Flyleaf, we'd be grateful for a donation. There's a donate button on the bottom of the screen, and that helps us power our programming and keep the lights on and do nice things for our community through what's a pretty weird time for the store. So we really appreciate that. And then, of course, keep an eye out on our website and our newsletter for upcoming events. We've switched over officially to Crowdcast, so you should be able to click on our profile. Or it might be if you click on Flyleaf Books, hover over my face and click on Flyleaf Books, you can look at the other events we have coming up. So definitely keep checking back, and we look forward to seeing you guys some more. And thank you again, Nick and Cecelia.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.